Last week we talked about our safest and most concerning position groups, and all four of those position groups ended up being on offense. We both felt the best, and I guess you could say the worst about position groups on the offense for IU. So makes sense to talk about the defense because obviously we don't just know one side of the ball. Rather than going safest and most concerning position groups on this side, let's just have some overall thoughts. We have four categories. Our favorite position group, I guess you could say the safest. Our individual MVP if we're looking at a specific player. An underrated player, maybe a little bit further down on the depth chart that we saw in spring. And then the greatest weakness overall of the defense. Obviously, it's going to be hard to find weaknesses with this team, with this defense, as we mentioned last week. But they obviously exist, and they obviously could be exposed by some of those teams in the middle of the schedule in October. Ohio State, who we'll talk about later in the show. So we'll start with that. IU's defense, kind of just overviewing that side of the ball. We'll talk about Ohio State. Brooks knows a lot about Ohio State. I know a normal amount about Ohio State. And we'll do a little State of the Buckeyes address, talk about where Ohio State stands at this time as the favorite to win the Big Ten in 2026. And then we'll talk about the new ACC tiebreakers, just because I think they're super interesting and worth discussing a little bit later on as well. That's some news that came out a few days ago as ACC Media Days get underway. But let's start with the defense on IU, the team that we cover for the Hoosier Network. Favorite position group. I'll let you go ahead and start. I think we have different ones, if I remember correctly. And, yeah, I'd love to know who you're most looking forward to seeing for IU in terms of potential for success this season.
Yeah, I love the cornerbacks. I think it's a good room. Bryant Haynes as a defensive coordinator, he doesn't leave much room for doubt. Really every position group is pretty solid across the board. They lose a lot of guys, but this cornerback room, Jamari Sharp, obviously, he is one of the returners who's going to have to step up. He made that big play, the national championship ceiling play in Miami, and they bring in A.J. Harris. I really, really like A.J. Harris. He was a transfer from Georgia originally, then to Penn State, now Penn State to Bloomington. So those two guys, I think they add a lot of length, and they're very quick. I also like Byron Baldwin Jr. and Jalen Bell, what they can do just as corners, maybe, just in that secondary. They're game wreckers. So Indiana, they have a lot of talent, and when you look at it, what they lost in the NFL draft, what they lost just from graduates from last year's team, they lost a lot, but they still have some very solid players in that on the defense and in that cornerback room. So I really like Jamari Sharp. I think he is the leader who's going to step up. He looks like, just from pictures, he looks like he's bulked up a little bit. And A.J. Harris, when you pair him up alongside him, I mean, it'll make life tough for a lot of wide receivers, especially in that Big Ten schedule.
Absolutely. That's a great pick right there. You could also go defensive line or linebacker, and I went linebacker with this one. Defensive line might have the most talent, and if we had, our guy Noah Gurkey, who we cover this team for with the Hoosier Network, loves the defensive line. I think that if he was on the show, he would pick the defensive line. I don't want to speak for him, but just I know that he really likes that group. He really likes those transfer additions on the edge. Lots of talent there. You got the returners with Tyreek Tucker and Mario Landino. But I went linebackers because I like the experience, and you lose Aiden Fisher, and sometimes that's a major blow, and it probably should be a major blow for this team. But it's not, because Elijah Hardy and Isaiah Jones are more than capable of stepping up. They kind of already have when you look at last season, right? Really nice rotation with those linebackers. And so those two are experienced. They've been with Indiana. They've been with Kurt Signetti, and they're ready to step up and kind of, refill replace that production from Aiden Fisher. So sometimes, there's a lot of teams. Even on Indiana, if you look on the other side, we could, I think, pretty much at a consensus level, call Aiden Fisher the leader of the defense. Obviously, Fernando Mendoza, leader of the offense. You lose Mendoza and you bring in kind of another slightly unproven, like raw transfer in Josh Hoover, and there's at least some questions about it that at least I raised last week. And there's not that on the defense. You lose Aiden Fisher, and just complete confidence. I'm not worried at all about Elijah Hardy and Isaiah Jones, one or both or whoever, able to step up in that situation. So I like the experience, and I like the proven success at linebacker for Indiana. It's kind of that connective tissue of the defense, right, between the front and the secondary. I love, just in general in football, I love secondaries the most. I love pass defense the most. It's what I'm most interested in. My favorite aspect of football to study is pass defense and pass coverages. And then my favorite moments in football games are when you have an awesome pass defense, an awesome secondary, and still just the playmaking of a quarterback and a receiver is enough to beat it, and there's just nothing you can do about it. They're just too talented. Those amazing catches are my favorite moments. And the linebackers are obviously a part of that in pass defense in certain moments. So no Fisher, no problem, no worries, in my opinion, with Indiana. Obviously, there might be some level of a drop-off in production, but Elijah Hardy and Isaiah Jones are two of the most optimal players, two of the most optimal people to have in that situation, replacing, sort of following in the footsteps of Fisher, and I think they're more than capable of stepping up. So I like the linebackers a lot. That's my favorite position group. A little bit of a cop-out because it's also the smallest position group if you just count them as the three, right? There's 4 or 5 defensive linemen, about 5 players in the secondary, and just those 2 linebackers on the starting depth chart, so it's a little bit harder to find weak points, but that was my pick there. I like the secondary a lot, too. I just, in general, am partial to secondary, so that's partially why I avoided picking them, because I know that I have a pass defense bias in a lot of ways. But I like the linebackers quite a bit.
Yeah, I think the linebackers, I think the corners, I obviously picked them as the strongest group, but the linebackers, with it only being 2 guys, in Isaiah Jones and Elijah Hardy, they were both like solid contributors on last year's team. They also played 2 years ago as well. So coming into 3 seasons in a row in Bloomington with Curt Cignetti, they've been there the entire time. I think that also pays dividends because the linebackers are essentially the quarterback of the defense. They are instructing the other players. They're, manipulating the defense. And I think Elijah Hardy and Isaiah Jones, those are 2 guys who they might be some of the best linebackers in all of college football. You get them both back and pair it alongside, obviously one of the best defensive coordinators, Broyles Award winner, Bryant Haynes. I mean, those are the type of guys that you need on a defense, especially when you have a big target on your back, being the reigning national champions.
Yeah, they're vessels that kind of connect Bryant Haynes, the defensive coordinator, to the rest of the team. And it's for Bryant Haynes, I'm sure it's relieving or comforting to know, and on any defense, for any defensive coordinator, to know that you have a leader, typically a linebacker, who kind of is just a microcosm of yourself on the field. There's a better way to word that, but you get the idea where it's Bryant Haynes' mind on the field, just in a, in this case, a more athletic and actually college football player body. And you have that with both Hardy and Jones, as you did with Fisher last year. So that'll be fascinating for the team, the position group aspect for the IU defense. Individual MVPs, this is just our chance to say just straight up who we think the best player, the most valuable player on the defense is. I get so caught, at least personally, I get so caught up in trying to find niche picks and dark horses all the time, and sometimes I forget to mention who's just truly the best. And I'll let you go first here because I think you have an interesting name to share.
Yeah, I mean, we just talked about him. We spent a couple minutes, but I think Elijah Hardy is the best player on this defense. He's going to be the green dot wearer. I think he's the most important guy on this defense because that green dot is the person who Bryant Haynes is personally talking to, echoing or relaying the plays, and then Elijah Hardy has to echo that across the defense and across the field. He's 5'11", do-it-all linebacker. He's all over the place. Again, he's been here. He's going to be a junior, but he's been in Bloomington, for the past 3 years under Curt Cignetti. So he knows exactly what the expectation is, and I think he's going to take a big step up. He's wearing a new number as well, number 5, so we'll see if that flows into the swag that Elijah Hardy has. But I think he is the best player on this defense, and I think we're going to see it in 2026.
Absolutely. I went with Tyreek Tucker here. I like him a lot. He's a clear leader on the defensive line. I'm part of the reason why I put this in here is just to have a true opportunity to talk about the defensive line. But I also do truly believe he's kind of the individual MVP of this defense. He was a Curt Cignetti at James Madison, and he's a great example of someone that, when Curt Cignetti comes in and he brings in that transfer portal class in year one, one narrative that could have been discussed was that, it's Curt Cignetti and a ton of James Madison players. It's a ton of group of 5 players. Are they going to be able to contend in the Big Ten? But Tyreek Tucker is an example of someone where maybe James Madison just had a Power 4 player, and maybe James Madison just had a great talent that went maybe underappreciated in the recruiting cycle, and I think that's what happened with him. He's a leader. He's been with Kurt Signetti forever. He's been, from James Madison to Indiana. He's been a part of those great runs. It was a big deal when he announced that he was coming back, and rather than launching himself into the NFL draft, which he absolutely could have done. So a leadership, there's a leadership piece here with Tyreek Tucker. He's the one who speaks all the time. He's going to be at Big Ten Media Days. Him and Carter Smith are always there. A lot of it's because, they've been in the program, and Garrison kind of trusts them on a podium, I suppose. But in spring, we saw Tyreek Tucker speak. It seems like at every turn, in every situation, he's one of the players on the defense that steps up to kind of represent the defense vocally to the public. And he's also just awesome there on the interior defensive line. Plenty of impact there, and it's not. We talked about the great transfers on the edge for Indiana, and it's not just a great edge rushing group. It's obviously a great interior defensive line as well, with Mario and Landino, who's also someone that frequently speaks to the media. Tyreek Tucker's awesome, and he's this is I guess his last year, and with James, from the time in James Madison to now Indiana. He redshirted in 2022. He played quite a bit in his, I guess, redshirt freshman season there, James Madison, then transferred to Indiana. Has been a part of that whole journey. The whole Kurt Signetti journey, Tyreek Tucker has been a part of it. And he's made plenty of much of an impact throughout that entire time, and I'm excited to see him again in this last season, and I'm excited to hear from him quite a bit in this last season as well, as soon as in Chicago in about 2 weeks at Big Ten Media Days.
Yeah, I think Tyreek Tucker and Mario Landino, when you pair those two right next to each other, they're very big guys. Obviously, they're on the D-line, but, I mean, compared to other D-linemen, and especially in the Big Ten or in the first 3 weeks, I think we might be able to see some big-time plays from Tyreek Tucker in that defensive line when Indiana can just impose their will on the opponents, get it going, and if they can carry that momentum into Big Ten play, I think Tyreek Tucker, he's one of the best defensive linemen in the country. He is a big guy, and he's a leader. He has an amazing impact on the entire defense and Indiana as a whole. And like you mentioned, Tyreek Tucker, Carter Smith, another reason why they're there is because they could be Indiana's best players, Carter Smith and Tyreek Tucker. That's probably the reason why they are the spokespeople of Indiana football.
And two more players that could go very high in the NFL draft as well to kind of continue that IU to first-round draft pick pipeline. Let's go to our underrated players. I have one that I think so here's the truth. I printed out my prep before. I put all my stuff in, and then I printed out immediately. So I can't even see. I don't remember what you answered for all of these, which makes this even more fun and interesting. I imagine mine might be the most niche, though, and I'd love to hear your most underrated player on this Indiana defense that maybe won't play a lot. Maybe we saw them in spring, and maybe that's the most that we'll see of them, this calendar year. But someone that's underrated for the future of the program, or even the central to this team that we're going to see in 2026.
Yeah, I went with Byron Baldwin Jr. I mean, we talked a little bit about him. He's just so young. We haven't seen the full Byron Baldwin Jr. effect yet. I think he's going to take that next step up. We saw him a little bit, especially in that college football playoff run. But Byron Baldwin Jr., he showed a lot of flashes of talent. I think he's going to move into that new role in the secondary and on the defense. And he was just flying all over the place when he was on the field. I think now when he takes that next step up, he is going to be the most underrated player on this roster because I'm going to say on the roster because I think he just has that natural talent, natural ability. And when he is able to put that on display in Memorial Stadium, I think we'll see that in the fall. And I just think he's, frankly, just a beast. I don't know what you've seen from him or if you agree with me or not, but I think he is a game wrecker in the secondary if he can get his game going, especially early on in the season, and carry that into conference play.
Yeah, you make some strong points, and this is fascinating because I also picked a sophomore player in the secondary who we haven't seen a lot of but are potentially excited about the upside with. I picked Jalen Bell, and so here's the truth. I'm a bit of a hyper fixator, and sometimes I see something once and I just attach to it, and because I have no updated information, right? We saw this team in the spring game, and we haven't really seen this team in person since. And so my memories of the spring game are pretty much my memories of IU football at the moment. And that partially is why I'm so high on Tyreek Tucker, because we saw the defensive line really excel in that game. Also, there were two plays from Jalen Bell who, as you mentioned, when he was on the field, and there were injuries, right? There were some strange rotations. This team wasn't necessarily putting the same players on the field with one another that it will in the actual season when we get to the fall, right? We didn't see A.J. Harris, for example, in the secondary, but Jalen Bell. Two plays that stood out to me in the spring game. The first was I want to say it was a corner route from Nick Marsh in the end zone, and the ball's in the air, and you're thinking, this is the Josh Hoover to Nick Marsh moment. Like, this is the arrival. And what seemed like an intentional pass interference from Jalen Bell. That obviously isn't the most electric play in the world, but pass interference, flags thrown, there's no touchdown, and, to some degree, a heads-up play for a sophomore. And then the other one was just a pass breakup in the red zone, but one that, again, I just thought there was a lot of awareness there, a heads-up play. And it's two plays in a spring game that probably mean nothing and probably don't indicate a whole lot, but just they caught my eye, and I've been thinking about them ever since. And I wrote it down in my notes for the spring game. I mentioned it to you and Noah sitting next to me as well. Just something about Jalen Bell. I couldn't get my mind off him, which is probably just representative of the way my brain works. I just, I see one person do one thing well once, and then they're the best player on the team moving forward. But Jalen Bell is someone that I think there's something there. He's only a sophomore. I think that from an IQ perspective, from an awareness perspective, I think that there is something to be said about him. Again, I don't know how much he'll play. I don't know how much he'll get in. Maybe only when Indiana's up big on Howard or in Western Kentucky, some of those teams they play early in the schedule. But either way, I think if he sticks around at Indiana and if he develops and evolves and improves over the course of multiple off seasons, then I think Jalen Bell could be a name to know on this Indiana defense as a sophomore. He's listed on the second unit in the depth chart right now, at least the depth charts we've seen. Not sure what the building thinks of him at the moment, but I think that there's something there. I think there's some real upside. I think there's some real potential, which says a lot about the secondary because we both just picked true sophomore, players in that secondary that could potentially elevate to starting roles in the next couple of years and even contribute this season. So that's super fascinating. And I think you make a good point about Baldwin, in your eyes, being the most underrated player on the entire team because we know the offense super well. There's a decent amount of returners, and everyone pays more attention to the offense than the defense, I feel like. And so the defense has some names that are a little bit more diamonds in the rough, which speaks to, as a matter of fact, kind of my greatest weakness with this defense, if we want to just transition right into that. And I'll start here just because it flows well. Depth in certain areas is the primary weakness for the defense, and that's part of what we're discussing. If you look at the depth chart, there's a lot of names that you just don't recognize, and they're not all transfers. It's a lot of players that have just sort of elevated within the program, which isn't a problem. That's a natural progression of a roster. But in some cases, when you have true stars, say at linebacker with Hardy and Jones, if there are injuries at any point in the defense, say the defensive line is probably the deepest. I'm not sure if you agree with that, but the linebackers and in the secondary, I wonder a little bit about if disaster were to occur. I think it could really decimate the defense this season in a way it wouldn't necessarily have decimated the defense a year ago. So there's that aspect of football too, and that's something that I think we forget in the offseason is that, even if Indiana was miles better than everybody else, you could just have a disaster season. I mean, you and I, we both live in Indiana. We're familiar with the Indiana Pacers and what's gone on there, right? Like, sometimes it doesn't matter. If the universe decides that it's your year to suffer, then it can be your year to suffer. And I think the defense is particularly prone to that. That's really kind of like nitpicking at this defense and nitpicking at this team because, again, it's really hard to find a weakness in a team that won the national championship with an undefeated season last year and then did a great job in the transfer portal and was only elevating on the recruiting trail, etc. But the depth in certain areas is the greatest weakness for me with this defense, particularly on the back half of the field. And I'm interested to see how that plays out over the course of the season. Also, though, Indiana isn't notorious under Kurt Cignetti for just rampant injury, right? It's a team that seems to do well with conditioning and seems to do well with rest and taking care of the players and taking care of the physical bodies there. So we'll see how the season plays out. But that, I guess, depth would be the primary weakness, maybe a little bit too top-heavy in the secondary and the linebacker position. Do you agree with that, or do you think I'm being too harsh, or do you think I'm just trying to find a weakness on a team for the purpose of finding a weakness on a team?
No, I 100% agree with you. I think it's hard to find a weakness, like you mentioned, on a team who went 16-0 and did really well in the transfer portal and in the offseason. I think we'll find a real weakness maybe in the first 3 weeks when we see Indiana against lesser opponents, see how they adapt to that, and especially since they're all at home. So we'll see some type of weakness potentially, but like you mentioned, it's all about injuries and depth. And Kurt Signetti has his practice plan that he sticks by, of shorter practices and more intentional practices. And obviously that has worked for Kurt Signetti and it's worked for Indiana. I think that also helps the players keep them fresh and try and avoid injuries, especially in practice when you're not going full contact the entire time or for a smaller amount of time. So I think if any position group faces any type of injury, the linebackers, in my opinion, would be the biggest concern, just because of how much I like those two guys in Elijah Hardy and Isaiah Jones. They are, like I said, they could be one of the best linebacker pairings in the entire country. So an injury there, you would have to rely on that depth, which, we'll see if that ever happens. Hopefully that doesn't happen for Indiana, but I think those two guys are game wreckers in their own right. So, and any injury would be detrimental to the defense.
Absolutely. And you said something there that just sparked an idea for me, and this will never happen, but you talked about how there could be some true flaws, some true weaknesses, and it takes me back to last season when there was that long touchdown pass by Illinois, and then after the game, Kurt Signetti mentioned how there were like 7 or 8 or 5 or 6 or whatever number he suggested, several just major breakdowns in the defense in the secondary, and Illinois only exploited one of them, but they could have had 5 or 6 touchdowns on those plays, and that triggered a moment for me where I was thinking, oh my goodness, when Dante Moore is playing Indiana, is this going to happen again? And it is an offense and a quarterback that's more capable of exploiting those weaknesses, going to be able to really run up the score in Indiana. But Indiana covered up those issues, right? They figured it out. They solved the problem over the course of the season. And so it just sparks the idea for me that both seasons, these last, and it's by design, that, Indiana canceled its home and home with Virginia. They're based on the way the playoff is and the way strength of schedule is valued and all of that. Signetti said himself he's more focused on the conference games. The non-conference games are more like tune-ups or cupcakes, if you want to be a little bit harsher, for Indiana than maybe some other teams. But I'd love to see, something like Ohio State, Texas, something like Clemson, LSU, like Indiana versus Georgia in week 1. Any Indiana team under Kurt Signetti, I'd love to see them play a really tough opponent at the very beginning, because so many teams have that experience, and it kind of really messes up the season, especially in the 4-team playoff, where you just have so much less margin for error, and it's not really your fault. Like, you had some kinks to work out, you had some weaknesses to recognize and solve early on. So it's just interesting how scheduling has changed and how scheduling is even different across conferences and across programs. And I wish we had that opportunity. I'm really disappointed about the Indiana Virginia home and home. Every once in a while I remember about it, and I just I also have family that went to Virginia, so I'd love to make that trip. But regardless, that's super interesting to me, and it speaks to the defense as well, and it's relevant to the defense as well, because last season those secondary breakdowns were seemingly a real issue early in the season. Maybe Signetti, exaggerated it or blew it up a little bit. He's known to do that as well. We know with the Nick Marsh moment and the gold shoes, there perhaps was some strategy behind trying to motivate the players. But it's interesting. It's a situation with a schedule where Indiana really maximizes its opportunity to ramp up towards success towards the end of the season. And that's just something that hit my brain, and I don't know if I'd think of that again. So I'm glad I had the opportunity to say it.